In this class, we will study Shakespearean stage and Romeo and Juliet. In Act 3, Mercutio leads the action and is in this most dramatic of the five acts. When wounded, he cries out, a plague go, both your houses, saying it 3 times to ensure that it becomes a curse. Indeed, it is the plague which causes the final death of both Romeo and Juliet. Friar John says that he was unable to deliver the letter to Romeo because the searchers of the town, suspecting that we both were in a house where the infectious pestilence did reign, sealed up the doors and would not let us forth. One of the most beautiful soliloquies is that of Juliet when she beckons for nightfall, again representing the contrast to the disorder of the day's events. Come, gentle night, come, loving black browed night, give me my Romeo, and when he shall die, take him and cut him out in little stars, and he'll make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night, and pay no worship to the garish sun. The nurse's arrival in this act with information about Romeo and Tybalt reinforces the fact that this is now a tragedy, not a comedy. This can be seen in the contrast of the scene with the first scene, where the nurse withholds information from Juliet. In the first scene, the nurse is playfully devious in telling Juliet about where Romeo wants to meet her for their marriage. Now, however, the same playfulness is no longer comic. Rather, it is infuriating. In this sense, Shakespeare turns the nurse from a comic character into a tragic character. She is a character who cannot realize the importance of what she is saying. Now, Juliet's dedication to Romeo emerges very strongly at this point, and at first, she derides Romeo for killing Tybalt, but she soon has a change of heart and says, she quotes, shall I speak ill of him that is my husband? She unquotes. She then states that she would sacrifice 10,000 Tybalts to be with Romeo, and later includes her parents in the list of people she would rather lose than Romeo. This dedication to a husband or lover is something which emerges frequently in Shakespeare and is a point he tries to emphasize. Romeo's misery at being banished is clearly shown in his performance for death. The banished is death mistermed, calling death banished. Thou cuttest my head off with a golden axe. Fry Lawrence tries to show him that by being alive, he at least still has a chance to see Juliet again. Even the nurse, entering where Romeo is hiding, says, she quotes, stand up, stand up, stand up, you be a man. She unquotes. The analysis of the first act introduced the image of the Wheel of Fortune. This was applied to Juliet, who throughout the previous act rose from a humble daughter to become a strong woman, standing on a balcony and completely in change of a situation. However, at this juncture, the nurse informs Romeo that Juliet downfalls again as a result of his banishment and the loss of Tybalt. Later, Juliet takes this image even further, saying, methinks I see thee, now thou art so low, as one dead in the bottom of a tomb, she unquotes. This is of course also is integrated with the foreshadowing so common in Shakespeare's plays that Lady Capulet comments about Juliet's refusal to marry Paris that I would the fool who married to her grave, she unquotes. This phrase will of course come true quite soon where Juliet dies while still married to Romeo. The conflict between the older generation and the younger comes to head in the final scene of the Act 3. The nurse advocates that Juliet forget about Romeo and instead focuses on Paris, the virtues of whom she proceeds to extol. Now, Juliet, poisoningly sweet in her sarcasm, sends the nurse away from her for the first time, remarking, ancient damnation, both a reference to the nurse's age and to the problems she must deal with. This leaves Juliet completely alone to face the hostile world. In Act 4, Scene 1, Paris is speaking with Friar Lawrence about the wedding with Juliet. Friar Lawrence, aware that Juliet cannot marry Romeo, is full of misgivings. Juliet enters and is faced to speak with Paris, who acts arrogant now that the marriage is going to happen. Juliet rebuffs him by giving vague answers to his questions. She finally asks Friar Lawrence if she can meet with him alone, meaning that Paris has to live. Friar Lawrence comes up with a rash plan to get Romeo and Juliet together. He gives Juliet a poison which will make her appear dead to the world. In this way, rather than marry Paris, she will instead be placed in the vault where all deceased Capulets are buried. Friar Lawrence will then send a letter to Romeo telling him what is being done so that he can return and sneak Juliet out of the tomb and also away from Verona. In scene 2, Juliet arrives home and tells her father that she has repented her sin of being disobedient to him. He pardons her and happily sends her off to prepare her clothes for the wedding day. Capulet then goes to tell Paris that Juliet will marry him willingly. In scene 3, Juliet convinces both her mother and the nurse that she wants to sleep alone that night. She prepares to drink the poison that Friar Lawrence gave her, but cautiously puts a knife next to her bed in case the potion should fail to work. Juliet then drinks the potion and falls motionless onto her bed. In scene 4, the nurse goes to fetch Juliet but instead finds her lying dead. Lady Capulet enters and also starts lamenting her daughter's demise. Capulet then arrived and discovering his daughter has committed suicide, orders the music to change to funeral tunes. The tragic failure of his plans is treated as a disastrous accident for which Friar Lawrence bears no responsibility. In contrast, it is a challenge to situate Paris along the play's moral continuum. He is not exactly an adversary to Romeo and Juliet, since he never acts consciously to harm them or go against their wishes. Like almost everyone else, he knows nothing of their relationship. Paris' feeling for Juliet are also a subject of some ambiguity. Since the audience is never allowed access to his thoughts, later textual evidence does indicate that Paris harbors a legitimate love for Juliet, and though he arrogantly assumes Juliet will want to marry him, Paris never treats her unkindly nevertheless because she does not love him. He represents a real and frightening potentiality for Juliet. Once again, Juliet demonstrates her strength. She comes up with reason after reason why drinking the sleeping potion might cause her harm, physical or psychological, but chooses to drink it anyway. In this action, she not only attempts to circumvent the forces that obstruct her relationship with Romeo, she takes full responsibility for herself. She recognizes that drinking the potion might lead her to madness or to death. Drinking the potion, therefore, constitutes an action in which she takes her life into her own hands and determines its worth to her. In addition to the obvious foreshadow in Juliet's vision of Tybalt's vengeful ghost, her drinking of the potion also hints at future events. She drinks the potion just as Romeo will later drink the apothecary's poison. In drinking the potion, she not only demonstrates a willingness to take her life into her own hands, she goes against what is expected of women and takes action. In the mourning for Juliet, the Capulets appear less as a hostile force arrayed against the lovers and more as individuals. The audience gains an understanding of the immense hopes that the Capulets had placed in Juliet as well as a sense of their love for her. Similarly, Paris's love for Juliet seems wholly legitimate. His wailing cannot simply be taken as grief over the loss of a wife who might have brought him fortune. It seems more personal than that, more like grief over the loss of a loved one. Many productions of Romeo and Juliet cut the scene depicting Peter and the musicians. Productions do this for good reason. The scene's humor and traded insults seem ill placed at such a tragic moment in the play. If one looks at the scene as merely comic relief, it is possible to argue that it acts as a sort of caesura. A moment for the audience to catch its breath from the tragedy of Act 4 before heading into the even greater tragedy of Act 5. If one looks at the scene in context with the earlier scenes that include servants, a second argument can be made for why Shakespeare included it. From each scene, including servants, we gain a unique perspective of the events going on in the play. Here, in the figure of the musicians, we get a profoundly different view of the reaction of the lower classes to the tragedy of Juliet's death. Initially, the musicians are wary about playing a happy song because it will be considered improper, no matter their explanations. It is not, after all, for a mere musician to give explanations to mourning nobleman. And as the scene progresses, it becomes clear that the musicians do not really care much about Juliet or the tragedy in which she is involved. So they care more about the fact that they are out of a job and perhaps that they will miss out on a free lunch. So, in other words, this is a great tragedy, which is undoubtedly a tragedy of epic proportions, is still not a tragedy to everyone. In Act 5, Scene 1, Romeo has had a dream in which Juliet finds him dead, which has disturbed him. His servant Balthazar arrives in Mantua from Verona with news that Juliet is dead. Romeo immediately orders him to bring a post horse so that he can return to Verona and see her for himself. Romeo then finds a poverty-stricken apothecary and pays him for some poison. In scene 2, Friar John arrives to tell Friar Lawrence that he was unable to deliver the letter to Romeo. His excuse is that some people were afraid he carried the pestilence, the plague, and refused to let him out of a house. Friar Lawrence realizes that this destroys his plans and orders a crowbar so that he can go rescue Juliet from the grave. In scene 3, Romeo and Balthazar arrive at Juliet's tomb, where Paris is standing watch to ensure no one tries to rob the vault. Paris sees Romeo and frights him, but is killed in the process. His page then runs off to fetch the city watchman. Romeo opens up the tomb and sees Juliet. He sits down next to her, takes a cup and fills it with the poison, then drinks it and dies kissing Juliet. Friar Lawrence arrives only seconds later and discovers that Paris has been killed by Romeo. Now Juliet awakes and finds Romeo dead beside her, with the cup of poison still next to him. She kisses him, hoping some of the poison will kill her as well. Friar Lawrence pleads with her to come out of the vault, but instead Juliet chooses to kill herself with Romeo's dagger. At this point, the watchmen arrive along with the prince, Montague, and Capulet. Friar Lawrence tells them the story as he knows it, and Balthazar gives the prince a letter written by Romeo which verifies the story. Montague, in order to make amends for Juliet's death, tells them he will erect a golden statue of her in Verona for all to see. Not to be outdone, Capulet promises the same of Romeo. The prince ends the play with the words, "For never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo." Now we'll see the analysis of Act 5. Much in the way that the characters in Richard III dream about their fates in the final act of the play, Romeo too has a dream which tells of his fate. "I dreamt my lady came and found me dead." The use of dreams is meant to foreshadow, but also heightens the dramatic elements of the tragedy by irrevocably sealing the character's fate. When Romeo goes to the apothecary to buy his poison, it is as if he were buying the poison from death himself. Note the description of the apothecary. He quotes, "Meagre were his looks, sharp misery had worn him to the bones." He unquotes. He is clearly an image of death. Romeo pays him gold, saying, "There is thy gold," words poison to men's souls. This description of gold ties into the conflict between gold and silver. It is gold that underlies the family feuding even after the death of both Romeo and Juliet, when Capulet and Montague try to outbid each other in the size of the golden statues. Thus, for Romeo, gold really is a form of poison since it has helped to kill him. Since it has helped to kill him. The analysis of the first act pointed out some of the numerous sexual references throughout the play. In the final death scene, there is even the full force of the erotic element. Romeo drinks from a chalice, a cup with a shape that is often compared to the torso of a woman. Meanwhile, Juliet says, "O happy dagger, this is thy shape. They rust and let me die." The dagger is of course, Romeo's, and the sexual overtones are starkly clear. In addition to this, there is ambiguity about the use of the word die. To die actually had two meanings when Shakespeare was writing, meaning either real death or sexual intercourse. Thus, even at the very end of the play, we cannot be sure from the words alone whether Juliet is committing suicide or engaging in sexual relations with Romeo. So, final comment concerns Friar Lawrence. His actions at the end of the play are remarkable for a holy man because he attempts to play God, and Friar Lawrence gets Juliet to drink a potion which puts her to sleep, faking death, and then he tries to resurrect her. In his attempt to play God, Friar Lawrence is condemned to fail by the simple arrogance of his act. This time, this tie-in with the death of Christ would not have escaped the Christian audiences watching the play. Now we'll see the thematic study of the play. So first is Romeo and Juliet as the love tragedy. Romeo and Juliet is the most famous love story in the English literary tradition. Love is naturally the play's dominant and most important theme. The play focuses on romantic love, especially the intense passion that springs up at first sight between Romeo and Juliet. In Romeo and Juliet, love is a violent, ecstatic, empowering force that supersedes all other values, loyalties, and emotions. In the course of the play, the young lovers are driven to defy their entire social world, such as families, deny thy father and refuse thy name. Juliet asks, "Or if thou wilt not be, but sworn my love, and I'll no longer be a Capulet." Then friends, Romeo abandons Mercutio and Benvolio after the feast in order to go to Juliet's garden and ruler. Romeo returns to Verona for Juliet's sake after being exiled by the prince on pain of death. So love is the overriding theme of the play. But a reader should always remember that Shakespeare is uninterested in portraying a pitted up, dainty version of the emotion, the kind that bad poets write about and whose bad poetry Romeo reads while pinning for Rosaline. Love in Romeo and Juliet is a brutal, powerful emotion that captures individuals and catapults them against their world and at times against themselves. The powerful nature of love can be seen in the way it is described, or more accurately, the way descriptions of it so consistently fail to capture it entirely. And at times, love is described in the terms of religion, as in the 14 lines when Romeo and Juliet first meet. At others, it is described as a sort of magic, alike bewitched by the charm of looks. Juliet perhaps most perfectly describes her love for Romeo by refusing to describe it. She quotes, "But my true love is grown to such excess, I cannot sum of half my wealth." Love resists any single metaphor because it is too powerful to be so easily contained or understood. So Romeo and Juliet does not make a specific moral statement about the relationships between love and society, religion and family. Rather, it portrays the chaos and passion of being in love, combining images of love, violence, death, religion, and family in an impressionistic rush leading to the play's tragic conclusion. Then, second is love and violence. The themes of death and violence permeate Romeo and Juliet. They are always connected to passion, whether that passion is love or hate. This connection between hate, violence, and death seems obvious, but the connection between love and violence requires further investigation. Love in Romeo and Juliet is a grand passion, and as such, it is blinding. It can overwhelm a person as powerfully and completely as hate can. The passionate love between Romeo and Juliet is linked from the moment of its inception with death. Tybalt notices that Romeo has crushed the feast and determines to kill him, just as Romeo catches sight of Juliet and falls instantly in love with her. From that point on, love seems to push the lovers closer to love and violence. Romeo and Juliet are plagued with thoughts of suicide and a willingness to experience it. Romeo brandishes a knife in Friar Lawrence's cell and threatens to kill himself after he has been banished from Verona and his love. Juliet also pulls a knife in order to take her own life in Friar Lawrence's presence just 3 scenes later. After Capulet decides that Juliet will marry Paris, Juliet says, he quotes, "If all is fail, myself have power to die." Finally, each imagines that the other looks dead the morning after their first and only sexual appearance. So, this theme continues until its inevitable conclusion, double suicide. So, this tragic choice is the highest, most potent expression of love that Romeo and Juliet can make. It is only through death that they can preserve their love, and the love is so profound that they are willing to end their lives in its defense. And in the play, love emerges as an immoral thing, leading as much to destruction as to happiness. But in its extreme passion, the love that Romeo and Juliet experience also appears so exquisitely beautiful that few would want to resist its power. Then third is the individual versus society. Much of Romeo and Juliet involves the lovers' struggles against public and social institutions that either explicitly or implicitly oppose the existence of the love. Such structures range from the concrete to the abstract, like families and the placement of familial power in the father, law and the desire for public order, religion, and the social importance placed on masculine honor. These institutions often come into conflict with each other. The importance of honor, for example, time and again, results in brawls that disturb the public peace. Though they do not always work in concert, each of these societal institutions in some way present obstacles for Romeo and Juliet. The enmity between their families, coupled with the emphasis placed on loyalty and honor to kin, combine to create a profound conflict for Romeo and Juliet, who must rebel against their heritages. So it is possible to see Romeo and Juliet as a battle between the responsibilities and actions demanded by social institutions and those demanded by the private desires of the individual. Romeo and Juliet's appreciation of night, with its darkness and privacy, and the renunciation of the names, with its attendant loss of obligation, makes sense in the context of individuals who wish to escape the public world. But the lovers cannot stop the night from becoming day, and Romeo cannot cease being a Montague simply because he wants to. The rest of the world will not let him. The lovers' suicides can be understood as the ultimate night, the ultimate privacy. Then the fourth is the destiny of the lovers. In its first address to the audience, the chorus states that Romeo and Juliet are star-crossed, that is to say that fate controls them. This sense of fate permeates the play, and not just for the audience. The characters also are quite aware of it. Romeo and Juliet constantly see omens. When Romeo believes that Juliet is dead, he cries out, "Then I defy you, stars," completing the idea that the love between Romeo and Juliet is in opposition to the decrees of destiny. Of course, Romeo's defiance itself plays into the hands of fate, and his determination to spend eternity with Juliet results in their deaths. The mechanism of fate works in all of the events surrounding the lovers. The feud between their families, the horrible series of accidents that ruined Friar Lawrence's seemingly well intentioned plans at the end of the play, and the tragic timing of Romeo's suicide and Juliet's awakening. These events are not more coincidences but rather manifestations of fate that help bring about the unavoidable outcome of the young lover's death. Then fifth is images in the play. One of the play's most consistent visual motifs is the contrast between light and dark, often in terms of night and day imagery. This contrast is not given a particular metaphoric meaning. Light is not always good, and dark is not always evil. On the contrary, light and dark are generally used to provide a sensory contrast and to hint at opposed alternatives. One of the more important instances of this motif is Romeo's lengthy meditation on the sun and the moon during the balcony scene, in which Juliet, metaphorically described as the sun, is seen as banishing the envious moon and transforming the night into day. A similar blurring of night and day occurs in the early morning hours after the lovers only night together. Romeo forced to leave for exile in the morning and Juliet not wanting him to leave her room. Both try to pretend that it is still night and that the light is actually darkness. More light and light, more dark and our woes. More dark and dark our woes. Then sixth is different points of view. Shakespeare includes numerous speeches and scenes in Romeo and Juliet that hint at alternative ways to evaluate the play. Shakespeare uses two main devices in this regard: Mercutio and servants. Mercutio consistently skewers the viewpoints of all the other characters in the play. He sees Romeo's devotion to love as a sort of blindness that robs Romeo from himself. Similarly, he sees Tybalt's devotion to honor as blind and stupid. His punning at the Queen Mab speech can be interpreted as undercutting virtually every passion evident in the play. Now, Mercutio serves as a critic of the delusions of righteousness and grandeur held by the characters around him. Then, seventh is the dramatic use of the poison in the play. In his first appearance in Act 2, Scene 2, Friar Lawrence remarks that every plant, herb, and stone has its own special properties, and that nothing exists in nature that cannot be put to both good and bad uses. Thus, poison is not intrinsically evil, but is instead a natural substance made lethal by human hands. Friar Lawrence's words prove true over the course of the play. The sleeping potion he gives Juliet is concocted to cause the appearance of death, not death itself, but through circumstances beyond the friar's control. The potion does bring about a fatal result, like Romeo's suicide. And as this example shows, human beings tend to cause death even without intending to. So similarly, Romeo suggests that society is to blame for the apothecaries, a criminal selling of poison, because while there are laws prohibiting the apothecary from selling poison, there are no laws that would help the apothecary make money. So, poison symbolizes human society's tendency to poison good things and make them fatal, just as the pointless. So, Capulet Montague feud turns Romeo and Juliet's love to poison. After all, unlike many of the other tragedies, this play does not have an evil villain, but rather people whose good qualities are turned to poison by the world in which they live. Then the eighth we have thumb biting. In Act 1, Scene 1, the buffoonish Samson begins a brawl between the Montagues and Capulets by flicking his thumbnail from behind his upper teeth, an insulting gesture known as biting the thumb. He engages in this juvenile and vulgar display because he wants to get into a fight with the Montagues but doesn't want to be accused of starting the fight by making an explicit insult. Because of his timidity, he settles for being annoying rather than challenging. So the thumb biting represents the foolishness of the entire Capulet and feud and the stupidity of violence in general. Then last we have Queen Mab. In Act 1, Scene 4, Mercutio delivers a dazzling speech about the fairy Queen Mab, who rides through the night on her tiny wagon, bringing dreams to sleepers. One of the most noteworthy aspects of Queen Mab's ride is that The dreams she brings generally do not bring out the best sides of the dreamers, but instead serve to confirm them in whatever vices they are addicted to. For example, greed, violence, or lust. So, another important aspect of Mercutio's description of Queen Mab is that it is complete nonsense, albeit vivid and highly colorful. Nobody believes in a fairy pulled about by a small grey coated gnat, whipped with a cricket's bone. Finally, it is worth nothing that the description of Mab and her carriage goes to extravagant lengths to emphasize how tiny and insubstantial she and her accoutrements are. Queen Mab and her carriage do not merely symbolize the dreams of sleepers, they also symbolize the power of waking fantasies, daydreams, and desires. So through the Queen Mab imagery, Mercutio suggests that all desires and fantasies are as nonsensical and fragile as Mab, and that they are basically corrupting. This point of view contrasts starkly with that of Romeo and Juliet, who see their love as real and ennobling. So this unit structurally falls into three stages: introduction of characters and brief sketches of the major characters, scene-wise summary of each act followed by critical analysis of the acts and thematic discussions of the play.